Susan Taylor hadn't expected to end up here. When her uncle passed away, he left her the sprawling but creaking old house on the edge of town. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life away from the noise of the city. But the house was unfamiliar, its shadows stretching long into the night, and this was only her third night there. The rhythmic creaking had become part of Susan Taylor's nights. She tried to ignore it at first, brushing it off as an old house complaining under the weight of time. But it was too deliberate, the sound of slow, measured footsteps pacing above her head. The attic. Always the attic. Susan ventured up there on the second night, flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam of light cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing stacks of forgotten boxes and draped furniture. Disturbed by her intrusion, dust motes swirled in the air, but there was nothing. No one was there. Satisfied it was just the groans of an old house, she locked the attic and went back to bed. The next morning, the footprints appeared. They were small, muddy, and impossibly clear against the wooden floorboards leading from the attic door to the top of the stairs. Susan stood there for what felt like hours, her mind racing to rationalize the scene. Maybe she'd walked through mud and forgotten? But no, the prints were tiny, unmistakably child-sized, and she lived alone. She cleaned them up, convincing herself the prints had been there the whole time, she had just not seen them. But the next morning, they were back. This time, they were further down the hall. Each night, the rhythmic creaking resumed, and each morning, the footprints were closer to her room. By the fourth night, Susan barely slept, ears straining against the silence, waiting for the steps to begin. When they did, her stomach knotted. It was different this time. The footsteps were heavier, deliberate, and they didn't stop at the bottom of the stairs. They moved down the hallway. Her breath caught as the creaking grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside of her bedroom. The door handle rattled. She froze, clutching the covers, heart pounding so loudly she feared it might drown out whatever was outside. Then, faintly, a whisper reached her ears. "I'm almost there." Susan didn't move a muscle. She sat completely still for what must have been hours. When dawn finally broke, she mustered the courage to open the door. The footprints were there, leading from the attic, down the hall, stopping just inches from her bedroom door. She couldn't ignore it any longer. That day, looking frazzled and unkempt, Susan called a locksmith, insisting the attic be bolted shut. The man gave her a concerned look, but did as she asked. That night, for the first time in almost a week, she felt a shred of peace. The attic door was locked, and the footprints couldn't come. But they did. It started at midnight. The creaking was louder, angrier, as if someone or something was slamming against the bolted door. Susan sat upright in bed, paralyzed, staring at the door. Then, with a deafening crash, the sound stopped. Silence blanketed the house. Susan didn't dare leave her bed until the morning light streamed through the curtains. When she finally opened her bedroom door, her stomach turned. The footprints were back, but this time, they weren't muddy. They were crimson red. The trail led not just from the attic door, but all through the house, circling her living room, her kitchen, and finally ending at the foot of her bed. Susan backed away, trembling, only to hear it again, that whisper, impossibly close. "I'm here." She spun around, but the room was empty. Panic began to set in. She grabbed her keys, her phone, and fled the house, vowing never to return. She checked into a motel, telling herself she'd figure it out in the morning. Maybe hire someone to investigate, or better yet, sell the place and leave it all behind. That night in the motel, she finally felt safe. The silence was comforting, the bed unfamiliar but blissfully free of creaking. Sleep came easily for the first time in days. But just as her dreams began to take hold, a familiar sound pulled her back to reality. Her blood ran cold. It couldn't be. She was miles from the house. Slowly, Susan turned her head toward the motel room door. The rhythmic sound was closer now, just outside. The door handle rattled, and she scrambled back against the headboard, fumbling for her phone. Her trembling fingers managed to turn on the flashlight, and as the beam illuminated the door, she saw it. Tiny, child-sized footprints pressed into the motel carpet, leading straight to her bed. Before she could scream, the lights flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. And then, in the black, she felt it, the icy grip of a small hand wrapping around her ankle. The whisper came again, this time from beneath the bed. "You can't leave me." Every night, without fail, Sean would tuck his 7-year-old son in at bedtime. It was their special routine, a comforting ritual that ensured the boy could drift into a peaceful sleep. Tonight was no different, or so the father thought. The bedroom was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon. His son lay under the covers, propped up on his elbows as if he'd been waiting. His blanket was pulled tight around him, but there was something about him tonight that felt off. The father paused in the doorway. "Hey, bud," the father said with a warm smile, masking the unease that tugged at him. "Ready to sleep?" His son didn't respond right away. He just grinned, a wide, unnerving grin that seemed a little too big for his face. "You okay, buddy?" the father asked, his voice tinged with concern. The boy nodded slowly, his grin unwavering. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Daddy, can you check for monsters under my bed?" The father chuckled softly, relieved to hear the request. This was normal. His son had always been a little afraid of the dark, and asking to check under the bed was part of their nightly routine. "Sure thing, champ," the father said, kneeling down beside the bed. Huddled there, under the bed, trembling and pale as a ghost, was his son, his real son. Tears streaked his face, and his lips quivered as he whispered, "Daddy, there's someone on my bed."